Thank you for joining us today at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. I'm sure that it hardly needs to be mentioned that today is March 11th, and just a few minutes ago, 4 years ago, we were all looking around panicked as the earthquake had just hit, and we were feeling aftershocks. I'm sure those of us who were in Japan, remember exactly where we were and what we were doing at that time, whereas we probably can't say what we were doing the day before that. But on that occasion, one of the major aspects of the events of that day was that it provoked the Fukushima nuclear accident, in which 3 reactors melted down and spread a lot of radiation in the areas around Fukushima Prefecture and elsewhere. And we're still trying to assess what does that mean, and we're still dealing with the consequences. To help us to assess those consequences and to understand and to put in better context what it is that happened are 2 experts, scientists, who are going to give us some expert information. On the far side is Gerry Thomas. She is the chair in molecular pathology of the Imperial College of London. And sitting here next to me is Andrew Sherry, the chief scientist of the UK National Nuclear Laboratory. And they're going to tell us a lot about radiation and its effects and the degree to which the population of Fukushima should or should not be worried about it. So I turn it over first to Professor Sherry, and he will begin the presentation, and then we'd like to have about half of our time left for Q&A, so please think about your questions when we reach that point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here. It's good to be back in Tokyo. Well, just over 4 years ago, before the tsunami and the Fukushima nuclear accident, I was an academic at the University of Manchester, and both myself and I think Gerry had never spoken to anybody involved in the press or the television. But as the events around Fukushima started, we started getting phone calls, and we said yes to every interview that we were asked to give, because the public were very interested in what was happening. And from the information available to us, we tried to provide some comment on that to try and explain what was happening and to put it in context. Well, that was 4 years ago, and now in the UK, as in Japan, both countries are looking at how they generate their electricity and what energy mix they need. And in the UK, we are building new reactors because nuclear energy is an important component of our energy mix. And in Japan, after 4 years without nuclear energy, and remind ourselves, I think nuclear energy accounted for about 1/3 of the electricity in Japan at the time. Japan is thinking about restarting some nuclear reactors to generate electricity. And for every country, it's a different mix, and there are 3 or 4 drivers towards that mix. One is energy security. One is the need to move towards low-carbon energy. One is cost, and another driver is safety. And of course, as we look at our energy mixes, the view of the public towards those energy mixes is very, very important, because public support for any type of energy form is important, because it gives the political mandate to move forward in a particular direction. And when nuclear power is considered, there tends to be quite an emotional response, quite polarized views. People are either very for nuclear energy or very anti-nuclear energy. And part of the reason for that is the fear and the uncertainty around radiation and the effect of radiation on public health. And Gerry Thomas will be saying something about that. That's her field of expertise. But for me, one of the important things has been, how do we communicate with the public? And of course, that is your job. And the relationship between the press and the media, and how you comment on difficult, complex issues as generalists, is important. And that's one reason why in the UK, as academics, where we had experience in the nuclear field, we felt it was our duty to step forward and to speak to people like you and answer your questions as openly and as honestly as we could. And actually that had a very big effect on the public attitude in the UK to nuclear energy. After Fukushima, the public support for nuclear energy, which was reasonably high, dropped. But within about 6 months, it bounced back actually higher than it had been before. And thinking about that, we felt that actually the public trusted what the press and the media were reporting, and part of that was the comment of independent experts from universities, experts in their field, not part of the industry, who provided their honest views. And so in the UK, we're developing a strategy for how, as a sector, we interact with the public. An important part of that is how we interact with the media. And in the UK, we have a science media centre that has a network of journalists, media people, and a network of academic experts in a whole range of fields. And when there is a news story, be it to do with nuclear energy or something else, the Science Media Centre brings those two communities together and enables the right questions to be asked of the independent experts. And that's been really very powerful in the UK. And we're developing on that in terms of a strategy going forward. So that's all I was going to say. I'll hand over to Gerry Thomas now.
Good afternoon. As you know, this is not the first time I've been here. I was here about 6 months ago with Robin Grimes, also from the UK, as our Chief Scientist for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. I've been out to Japan a lot of times before Fukushima, and even more since. I've had the opportunity to go and speak to some of the local people in the Fukushima prefecture, to talk to some of the women's groups particularly, because women tend to talk more easily with women. And yesterday we were up in one of the other provinces where they're thinking about bringing the nuclear reactors back on stream, again to talk to some of the local groups, to talk to some of the academics in the area. Because the one thing I think that quite shocked me was the lack of input from Japanese scientists, Japanese independent scientists. In the UK, we've always prided ourselves on academia being very independent of government. And if government ministers think we're going to say what they want us to say, they have another think coming. We don't act like that at all. We give honest advice based on scientific evidence. And I was surprised there wasn't the same network in Japan. But I knew a lot of the Japanese scientists, and they asked me if I was prepared to come and talk to people in Japan, and particularly talk to the foreign media. I'd never had any experience of talking to the media before, at least not in a scientific way. I've done interviews about Morris dancing, but that's nothing to do with my scientific job. So it was quite interesting to see the interaction. And it made me realise just how important the role is between the community, the media, and the scientists. Because getting complex information over to the public is not easy. It's not easy for the scientists to put in a way that the journalists can digest and then put in the language that they need to use. And so finding that dialogue has been quite challenging at times. I think in the UK it was interesting. There was a group of us who didn't know each other. Because we work in different disciplines, we don't meet at meetings because we don't go to the same meetings. And it was quite nice for all of us to form a network that we could actually say, well, I understand this bit, you understand that bit, can you explain it to me? So I think there's been a great increase in dialogue between the scientific disciplines and between the journalists and ourselves and the public. And one of the problems you have with radiation is it actually involves all three sciences. So it involves physics, because you talk about radiation and half-lives, physical half-lives. It involves chemistry, because when you have an isotope that's released, where it goes in the body is governed by the chemistry of your body, and how long it stays there is governed by the chemistry of your body. And then the biology is the interaction with the biological structures which give you the health effects. Now, it's very difficult as a scientist to understand one science, so to get your head around all three is particularly difficult. So you can see why people have problems interpreting the data that comes out. And I think one of the major roles going forward for yourselves is to help interpret the data that is coming from the Health Management Survey for the public. I know many of my Japanese colleagues are still reticent about coming forward themselves and interpreting the data for you. So it may well fall upon your shoulders to do that. And there is one thing that I have noticed recently, particularly, is that it's quite difficult when you talk about screening a population, and you need to find a statistic to compare the results you're seeing from a screened population with a non-screened population. And the normal way that we would look at statistics for cancer is we take the cancer statistics which are based on operation. And what happens when you screen a population is you find cancers that were there in the population anyway, earlier, and you find them smaller, which is why we do breast screening. That's the whole idea. But we know that if you screen a population, you're going to find many more cancers than if you wait until they become apparent because somebody comes with a lump in the neck or whatever. So I see quite often quotations of comparisons of the results of the health survey, which is based on screening, with operation statistics, when in actual fact, and they're blank comparisons, there's no factor in there that weights the different types of information. In actual fact, you should be multiplying the statistics you have from the operations by about 1,000 or maybe more, maybe even 4,000. So to compare those two things is like comparing an apple and an orange. So I think one of the roles going forward is to interact better with the press to be able to help you put over the facts that are correctly interpreted, because there's no doubt that misinterpretation of the data that is coming from that survey, and there will be masses of data, will cause worry in the general population. So I think it's also almost a moral obligation on both the scientists and the press to make sure that we report that accurately. Because the one thing that we can be sure of, and the one thing that came out of all the work that we put in post-Chernobyl, was that actually the health effects caused by the radiation itself were very small, but the health effects that were caused by worrying about the radiation were much, much greater. And we published a paper that came out, because it was the 25th anniversary of Chernobyl 4 years ago as well, that came out a month after the Fukushima accident. And with the strapline at the end of that was, we have not learnt how to explain risk to the population. If we do not learn how to communicate the risk of a nuclear accident in health terms better, then we have learnt nothing from Chernobyl. What do? We made exactly the same mistake again. And I think it is important going forward we learn that lesson, because you are going to have loads of data coming from that health survey. You are going to have masses of information for many years to come. So you need to make sure that what you report is correct, and it is correctly put in context. Otherwise, you could cause an awful lot of worry because you just haven't expressed things in the correct way. So I'm really here to say, can you help us get the information over to the public in a measured and appropriate manner? Thank you, that's all I've got to say.
Well, they finished up in about half the time that they had advertised to me previously. So that leaves us a wide field of time to ask them questions. You're a little too early there. No, chotomate. We have a long chance to ask them questions, so I hope that you have some questions to ask them. So from this point, where's the microphone? The microphone is here. So when I call on you, please come here, identify yourself and your affiliation, and then ask your questions. So I'm now looking to the floor for hands. All right, well, Mr. Fujita, you are well ahead of the crowd.
My name is Hiroki Fujita, and I'm with the Kokumin Shimbun newspaper, soon to be independent, perhaps. I'm a member of the Scientists for Accurate Radiation Information based in New York.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, maybe America.
Mm-hmm.
And there are about maybe 50 or so scientists specialized in radiation. And as a capacity of a journalist, I'm an associate member, getting information on a daily basis from 100 scientists. And what I learned from them is that we have a radiophobia.
Yeah.
But up until now, nobody killed
Absolutely.
by Fukushima radiation.
Absolutely.
But a lot of people die because they're, forcibly removed, and they were not, didn't have access to proper medication or treatment, or maybe their lifespan was shortened because of the stress.
Yeah.
Or circumstances.
Yeah.
So my question is that with the radiation dose so low, microsievert, not even millisievert, right? We shouldn't worry about radiation. And if we didn't, 4 years ago, worry too much about radiation, maybe we didn't have a ghost town that we have now in a Fukushima surrounding area.
Yeah.
We didn't have many people, over several thousand. In 3 months, over 2,000 people killed.
Yeah.
Not because of radiation, because, okay.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you. And I think you can understand, and I think it was appropriate in the first hours after the accident started to happen to remove the people from that area. I think in some respects it would be better to have moved them back faster, but there is a really important consideration here. And I asked a midwife who used to work in the Fukushima area that was evacuated. I said, would you go home? She has children herself. Would you go home if you were given the opportunity? She said, not the radiation that bothers me. What bothers me is my house is now overrun by rats and snakes. How can I bring my children up there? And I think if the area had been put back to normal, and it's quite striking when you go there, you go through wonderful rural Japan, there's beautiful, neat and tidy, and you suddenly hit an area where there's grass growing in out of the pavement, and it looks, unkempt, which for Japan is not normal. So you can see quite obviously where up to this area has been remediated and put back after the tsunami, and this area has been left. And it is quite shocking, and I think it must be quite upsetting for the people who still have property in that area to go back and see what it looks like. I mean, none of us are proud of a house that looks a mess, and I can see why that would be very upsetting. The trouble is you're sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't. If you don't move people away and then you stick by the conventions, the ICRP conventions, technically it's optional. You could move people back when it's 20 millisieverts over a year. But I think psychologically, once you've moved people out, it's almost as if you have to make it completely pure again before you move them back in. Whereas, if you look at it logically, we're all exposed to radiation. I went to the Fukushima power station last time I was over in October. I got more of a dose coming on the plane than I did while I was visiting the power station. So, is it more dangerous for me to fly here? Well, if you believe that radiation is very dangerous in low doses, then possibly. But I don't see any stickers on the British aircraft saying, don't come on here, danger, radiation. And I think we have a psychological issue with radiation, which is stopping us moving forward. And we really need to get our heads around the fact that we are a species that lives on a planet that is exposed to low-dose radiation. We do it all the time. So therefore, we have evolved mechanisms that help us cope with that. And actually, raising that dose level slightly doesn't make a big deal of difference. And in fact, there are areas in the world which are much higher than even the areas around Fukushima. And people live there perfectly okay with no effect on their health. Yet we think it's perfectly okay to go and smoke and drink, which is far more dangerous for our health than living in that area. We seem to have lost our ability to look at facts when it comes to radiation, and we need to find a way of redressing that. Where we get those ideas from, it's interesting to speculate. It's possibly things like, the comics people being bitten by a radioactive spider and getting special powers. And we've taken more notice of the fiction than we have of the facts. And it is really stopping us moving forward as a human community, not just in Japan, but elsewhere too.
It's one of the principles in our communications strategy in the UK that we're developing is clarity. And as Gerry has said, in an area which brings together physics, chemistry, biology, in an area where there is a great fear that's very real to people, to find a way to communicate what Gerry is saying in a manner that is clear, understandable, reasoned and correct is quite difficult. And as scientists, we're used to writing journal publications in very academic language and being very precise about what we say, and that's not the language of the general public. We have to think of new ways of communicating in a way which makes sense, is easily grasped, because one of the big observations I have, and radiation and public health isn't my field, but when we talk to people in the UK and say, what do you think when we say the word radiation, they talk about fear, they talk about cancer, they talk about deformed children, they talk about all these things. And then we say, well, what about medical, nuclear medicine and the radiation? Oh, that's good radiation. Well, it's the same radiation.
No difference.
And so finding ways to communicate this is a challenge, but I think a moral obligation, because the fear that people have, as we've heard, is causing more damage than the radiation, and that can't be right. And so I think we feel as scientists that we have to do something to correct this misunderstanding.
We were talking as well, if you imagine ourselves in 100 and 200 years' time looking back, and you imagine the discussions that were being had in London when we brought in electricity and we piped gas, highly flammable, nasty thing, gas, under our streets. And you can imagine the discussions, and there were, there's documented discussions of people going, oh no, this is the end of the earth, we must never do this. Yeah. And I wonder what people are going to look back in 100 years' time, and they're going to think exactly the same about us. What were they thinking about? They had the evidence there. Why didn't they look at the facts and interpret them? And we look at gas and electricity as a complete, given right now. We would be really upset if the gas company said, nope, too dangerous, must turn that off. Yet actually, more people have been killed in gas explosions than have been killed in anything to do with nuclear power.
Next question. Yes, sir.
Koto Honjo, associate. Could you explain how the Science Media Centre is organized in the UK and how you sort of draw the people in from both ends of the spectrum?
Certainly, yes. The Science Media Centre has existed for perhaps just less than 10 years. And I think it was first started either as a recommendation from the Royal Institution or perhaps even the House of Lords, I'm not certain. But it is led by Fiona Fox, who I think previously was a journalist and a scientific reporter, and so has got very, very good links into the journalist community and the media community within the UK. She has a team of maybe 3 or 4 other people, so it's a very small organisation, and it's funded from charitable donations. They're very clear that they need to be independent of any particular part of industry or indeed any particular part of the media. So they're funded from independent sources, and that's always a challenge. But what they've done over the years is when there has been a news story that has required scientific input, take GM crops, for example, or mad cow disease, or these sorts of things, or Fukushima and so on, they have gradually built up this network of scientists who work in universities, who are independent and who are experts in their field. And I think they've done that quite organically. They'll talk to me and they'll say, if I can't do a particular interview, do I know somebody else who can? And so their list grows and develops. And they've become trusted by the media and by the journalist community as an organisation that can give the media people who know what they're talking about, can speak from an independent perspective, can be not biased, and come across clearly and well. And so when the opportunity comes, either Fiona or one of her staff will phone the newspapers and organise a press conference. And I remember on the Monday or the Tuesday after the Fukushima accident, I was down at the Science Media Centre on my own with a zirconium fuel cladding tube with me to explain what we thought was happening in the reactor, and journalists could ask any question they wanted of me. And equally, she would phone up the BBC and Sky News and so on and say, if you need anybody to comment, then we can put you in touch with people. And equally, the journalist community and media community would phone into the Science Media Centre and ask for a list of names and experts in the field. And that tends to be the way it works. And both Gerry and I it was the first time we met on Radio 4, Materials World. There were 4 of us, a live half-hour radio programme especially given over to Fukushima, and I talked about nuclear reactors. Gerry talked about public health and radiation effects. And it's been extremely effective in the UK. Extremely effective. Now, I understand that there has been something similar here which maybe hasn't quite worked in the same way, but it's been very important, I think, in the UK to provide that bringing together of those two communities in a trusted way where any question can be asked, and if we don't know the answer, we will say we don't know the answer, or we can find out and we'll be in touch and so on. And so and now every time there's a news story around nuclear matters, either in the UK or anywhere around the world, and it's going to get reported in the UK press, we tend to get phone calls. In fact, I think the other point that's fair to say is the Science Media Centre's network reaches internationally, and so we found ourselves either on the BBC World Service or in radio phone-ins and things, answering questions from people all over the world, from New Zealand to Malaysia to Korea and Japan and so on. And we were only too pleased to do that.
I think one of the issues around the Science Media Centre in Japan might be the model that we use to fund it in the UK. Nobody is allowed to give more than a certain percentage of the costs required to run the centre. So no one organisation has a major stake in it. Everybody has an equal stake, and that keeps it very independent. That means nobody's agenda can be pushed. I'm not sure that you have the same ways of funding things. I know your attitude to charitable foundations and things is a little bit different in Japan. And it might well be that there needs to be a better model found to fund that independent centre in Japan. But I think it's needed in virtually every country where you're going to have science and journalists coming together, because we're actually very nervous. That's why you don't see very much of us. We don't like being outside our labs. We feel safe there. And from a very young age, you're told, be very careful of journalists. They will quote you and they will not quote you in context. So it's actually quite difficult to get scientists to come and talk to the media. And universities don't like bad publicity either, and everybody's always aware of the occasion when it goes wrong. So you find that scientists have been quite reticent to come forward. And I think Fukushima was a turning point, really, for scientists in the UK, because all of a sudden we realised that if you talk to journalists properly and you give them an honest opinion, they are human and they will talk back to you. But it took a lot of confidence building before I think many scientists would do that. And now our universities are actively encouraged to support people who talk about their science in the media. And when we put grants for research, we have to have a strategy for communicating that science as well. So I think there's been a major change in the way that we react with journalists in the UK. And it may be that that still needs to happen in other places. But I think when it does, it's very positive.
Hello, my name is Roger Pulvers. I'm an author and a journalist, unaffiliated journalist, and thank you very much for coming today for your presentation. One thing, Professor Gerry, which just disturbs me slightly in your presentation seems to be the premise that scientists are rational and have a grasp of the facts of the situation, and you use the term emotional responses, and that the general public is emotional. Having many relatives who are scientists, I can say very frankly that the opposite is often the case.
Oh, yes.
The UK is a country of a similar size to Japan. Japan is slightly bigger. Actually, Japanese are always talking about how small the country is, but it's bigger. Although the UK may be on the verge of getting smaller. And with our present government, Japan may be on the verge of getting slightly bigger. If Manchester, where you were, and say another city like Newcastle, had been bombed by atomic weapons 70 years ago, and upwards of 200,000 people, probably more when the toll is all put together, perished. And if the UK, like Japan, had 1/10 of the world's active volcanoes, series of, all throughout its history, major devastating earthquakes and tsunami, like the great Meiji Sanriku earthquake in 1896, the great Showa Sanriku earthquake in 1933, the former having killed 22,000 people, which is even more than 2011. Would you put down to a response on the part of the people of Great Britain as an emotional response, some feeling that perhaps nuclear energy is dangerous, even if the facts are that radiation itself may not have caused deaths? Finally, one more point. For the last 48 years, I've been going very often to a prefecture in Tohoku called Iwate Prefecture. I don't know if you've been up there.
Yeah, I've been there.
It's the largest, after Hokkaido, it's the largest prefecture in Japan. Iwate Prefecture has no nuclear power stations. Almost no one knows the reason why. It's never been made public, even in Japan. If there had been one in Rikuzen Takata, for instance, where I've been, and I don't know if you've been there, where that famous single pine tree is, and where the tsunami reached 12.8 meters, it's very likely that there would have been a serious nuclear accident there. Ex-Prime Minister Suzuki was born in a small town on the coast of Iwate Prefecture called Yamada. And when the decision came to be made on whether to put a nuclear reactor in Iwate Prefecture, he said no. He saw with his own eyes the devastation of the 1933 tsunami during the great Showa Sanriku earthquake, and decided there wouldn't be one in Iwate Prefecture. Is it possible that nuclear power is safe in some countries and not in others?
Can I just come back on that briefly? It's interesting. The reactors here did exactly what they were designed to do in the event of the earthquake. They were shutting down. The problem that we had in Fukushima Daiichi was the fact that it was a very big tsunami that swamped the diesel generators that were responsible for keeping it cold. But just down the coast, you have another power station that they were able to get electricity cables to and didn't have the same problem. I think knowing the geography and the geology and the fact that it was a place that was likely to eventually have a tsunami, maybe it could have been sited somewhere better. But the fact is, even though it was a massive earthquake, all of the reactors shut down beautifully. So actually the engineering was really good. The one mistake was to have the diesel generators on the ground floor. And with hindsight, you go, why didn't somebody think of that? Isn't it obvious? But in actual fact, the technology worked extremely well.
With all due respect, the best kept secret in Japan today is the degree of the damage to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plants done by the earthquake, not by the tsunami.
Roger,
And-
I'll let you have follow-up questions, so don't worry about it, yeah.
Maybe I can come back on a couple of points. Really good points. So thank you for sharing those. This point about facts versus emotion and that thing is really important because when we were looking at how we should communicate with the public, we tend to think, well, the public are the public. They're all the same. We have one communication, but we forget that people buy different newspapers. Some people get their news from the TV. Some people follow blogs on the computer. Some people are very accepting of technology and they'll be the first person to go and buy an iPad. Some people are very late adopters. Some people are very distrustful of technology. So people are all different. Some people work better on the, seeing columns of numbers and where's the line, am I above or below the line? Some people are more intuitive, and artistic and so on. So when I say, it's facts versus emotion, I'm simplifying what is a very complicated picture. And you're absolutely right. To communicate with some people, they would like to read the technical journal papers, see the data, review it for themselves, and that's absolutely the right way to go. But often, some people are more intuitive and, maybe they've heard things as they've grown up and they have a feeling about something. They respond on that level. And I think that's what I was trying to say. But I think what we have to do is find the way to communicate with that range of people in a range of different ways that works for them. It's not one size fits all. So I think that's the first point. The second point you made was also very, very important. The Japanese people have experienced atomic forces like no other place. And we need to remember that, understand that, and absolutely respect that. And Gerry may say something about the radiation impacts, and how they relate. But the important thing is that any country, any developing country or developed country, needs energy and needs electricity. It's fundamental to the way we live. I start a lecture that I give sometimes showing a photograph of a young man, and I say he came to the university on the metro. Last night he was cooking pasta on his electric cooker. His father's in hospital, he's just had a heart attack and is being treated, and his granny has got her laptop out and she's a silver surfer. What's common to all of these things? It's electricity. It's absolutely fundamental. So that's the first point. The second point is that we need, therefore, to find the right way for our country to generate the electricity that our population needs, to power our hospitals, to power our transport systems, to heat, to cool us, and all the modern comforts that we're used to. And the question then is, how do we do that? And for different countries, they will have different views, and what will be right for one country won't necessarily be right for another country. And far be it from me to say what is right for this country. But as you know, people are looking at the energy mix here. They're recognizing the imports that they're having to come in to gas-fired power stations and so on to provide that electricity. And they're questioning, well, maybe we need to think about nuclear energy as part of that. Within the UK, there are two overriding drivers to why we're doing nuclear there. One is security of electricity supply, and one is the the drive from the government that's now written in law to drive down our greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050 because of the impact of global warming, the impact of CO2 and other things out into the atmosphere that coal-fired power stations, our cars, oil, gas and so on are powering. So these are really big questions. And for some people, nuclear energy combined with renewable energy, combined with gas, with carbon capture and storage is the way they want to go. And in this country, they're looking at perhaps nuclear restarting that. And I think the important thing for me in that is that we need to find a way to communicate these big questions with the public and help them to come to their own views. I have a tool that I use, and I brought some with me, which little packs of playing cards. And every card is a different source of electricity. Coal, gas, nuclear, renewables, wind, and everything. And we've scored these different energy systems. Our PhD students did this for us, against how efficient is this, how energy dense is this, how, what about carbon emissions from this, and so on and so forth. And it's a little game. In the UK, they call it Top Trumps, and it's that sort of style of game. And it doesn't say whether nuclear is better than another. It just shows strengths and weaknesses, and people can come to their own view and play a game and enjoy it while they do so, and maybe learn something and think about why these things are so. And you're very welcome to take. I mean, I brought it back, and I don't want to take these back to the UK with me, so please take them. And any comments on this stuff, we'd be really grateful for those.
We played it on the train coming up, and I learned quite a lot actually from just playing with the cards. And you start to think, well, why is it that? And it starts to question, well, why do I think that about this power source and not about another power source? It's quite an interesting experience just to look at them. To come back to your reference to the atomic bombs, you have to remember that the radiation from the atomic bombs is very different from the radiation that comes out of a power station accident. So there are huge differences. And I think that's part of the reason we struggle with radiation, is because we think an atomic power station is the same as an atomic bomb. And the two are totally different. The amount of energy that comes out of them is totally different. The amount of contamination of different sorts of radiation is very different. So I think that plays into our misconceptions over some of the things we should be expecting when we have a nuclear power plant accident in terms of health. And I think actually, based on what we learned from the atomic bomb survivors cohorts that are here in Japan, we actually tended to overestimate the effects of radiation, because the atomic radiation that comes from a bomb is wave energy, and it's gamma, and so it goes everywhere. Whereas actually what happens when you have a nuclear power plant accident, it's specific isotopes that come out. There's not that much gamma released at all. And so the isotopes behave totally differently, because their behavior in the body is dependent on chemistry. And so iodine, which has a very short physical half-life but a very long biological half-life, is more dangerous to certain sections of the population. Interesting, not to everybody, but particularly to young children. An adult can have the same dose as a young child and will not show the same health effects, because the chemistry of the thyroid is different at that stage, and the biology of it is even more different. And cesium, which has a long physical half-life, has a relatively much shorter biological half-life. So the dose that you actually receive from cesium is way less than you receive from iodine if you happen to have eaten or drunk something that was contaminated. And the thing that most shocked me about Chernobyl, and I was very anti-nuclear till I started working on Chernobyl, and I had to change my views, because the scientific facts that we were uncovering just didn't fit the hypothesis I had. But it was interesting when I saw the epidemiology evidence, when they looked at the doses that came from living in areas that are quite highly contaminated with cesium, much higher than in Fukushima. The doses to the individuals over 25 years was less than one single CT scan, which we quite happily give adult patients really without thinking much about it. If you need it, you have it. And that amazed me, and I realised why we actually don't see as many cancers as we would have been expecting, because those doses are much lower, because the isotopes behave differently. So I think we've learned a lot from studying the atomic bomb survivors cohorts about radiation in general, but actually it isn't the same scenario as we see played out with the nuclear power plant accident. And we need to keep learning, and we need to keep studying. And we need to make sure we interpret the scientific facts properly. Otherwise, we could be leading ourselves astray. And the energy debate is such an important debate for everybody. Every citizen has a right to an opinion on the energy debate, because it really affects what's going to happen to us in future. You know, if you think back to our parents' generation to where we are now, what we use in energy terms is huge compared with that. Our lives would be totally unbelievable if we didn't have Google. How would we survive without the internet? All of that needs energy. And we know how fast technology is moving. So what else are we going to be able to do by the time our children are our age? So we have to start taking some very difficult decisions about how we want to have societies move forward. And we're all citizens, and we all have a right to be in the debate. And I think that's one thing we really have learned, that it is everybody's right to make decisions. It is not just the right of the companies or the government. And remember, we elect the politicians, so it's our responsibility to make sure we elect the right people to take the right decisions. Big things are changing in society. We're going to change the way we do the health service. We're going to change the way we diagnose patients. We're going to change the way that we get our energy to be able to diagnose patients and to be able to run our societies. And every single person has a right to express an opinion, and we should be listening to them. We shouldn't assume that we know what they're going to say. We should listen to them.
Are you going to want to follow up, or would you go to somebody else? Okay, please.
Hi, my name is Harumi Ozawa from AFP. I would like to ask Professor Thomas very, very specific advice. Over the past 4 years, the exclusion zone around Fukushima Daiichi plant has been shrinking, and it's because of the bans to enter this zone has been lifted just little by little, and we often meet, as being journalists, we often meet young mothers with small children debating whether they can go back to their original home community or not, even after their bans are lifted, because they're concerned about still the highly radiation fear. And so I would like to ask your advice as specifically as possible. Like, for example, 35-year-old mother, 4-year kid, maybe 5 years. If they go back to their own, the original home, like, for example, in the village of Kawamuchimura, what advice would you give? Like, for example, how many hours do you think that the young mother can let the children play outside a day? Yep. Or, for example, how often should they have health checks for children for thyroid cancer, for example?
What I'm going to say will probably shock you. The answer is move back and live a normal life. There should be absolutely no restrictions on it whatsoever. What we learned post-Chernobyl was the thing that causes the major health effect is iodine. Iodine has a very, very short physical half-life. Within 3 months of the accident of Fukushima Daiichi, there'd be no iodine left. So actually, there is no need to be anywhere away from there longer than 3 months. And we've got extremely good evidence that shows that if you start concentrating iodine in your thyroid when you are 3 months in utero, so 3 months after conception. If you were actually born or conceived after that time, so when the iodine had disappeared, so from the end of the year in 1986, you should no increase in thyroid cancer whatsoever. So we are very, very sure that what caused the problems post-Chernobyl was exposure to iodine. The other thing the Japanese government have done is to most effectively cut that food chain as well. Now, from Chernobyl, people have been living in the areas with relatively high cesium concentrations virtually from the word go. They moved back. It was their land. They'd lived there for years. Very similar cultural mores to the way the Japanese feel about their land. It's land that they own. They've lived there for generations, and they didn't want to leave it. So many of them moved back. They're not as obedient in Ukraine and Belarus and Russia as they are in Japan. And we've shown no health effects at all in that population. None whatsoever of the radiation. So why are we stopping people from moving back to land in Japan that is perfectly habitable, that we do not expect to see any health effects from? I think the major problem has been that once you move a population away for a long period of time, and we were talking to somebody whose family had moved from, the parents had stayed in Fukushima prefecture, but the younger couple had moved away with their children to live on the other side of Japan. When they were asked would they now move back because the restrictions had been lifted, they said, no, it's too long now. I've lived 4 years. My home is now here. And I think that is also part of the problem, is when you dislocate a community for a long period of time, you put down roots elsewhere. The children are in school. You don't want to move the children back out of school and move them back home. So part of that population will never move back. But it's nothing to do with the radiation. It's to do with the fact that they've got roots elsewhere, and they're used to being elsewhere. But I would say to any young mother wanting to move back, if I was in that situation, I would have absolutely no worries about moving my children back there. And you should be playing outside, because there's a really interesting piece of research. Andrew knew I was going to say this. A really interesting piece of research that shows that children in the Fukushima prefecture area who do not play outside and don't have the normal sort of active childhood that you would expect most children to have are actually getting fatter. They are 15% more obese. Now, actually, and I should know, and I should take my own advice on this, being fat is not good for you. It has a very significant effect on your health. And particularly obesity in childhood, we know it has grave problems for you as you grow older. So in actual fact, by restricting children playing outside because you're worried about the radiation, might not be doing them any favours at all.
Well, I'd like to ask a question. We're almost out of time. So please, if we have time, we'll come back to you, Mr. Fujita. You've outlined a scenario basically to us that basically worries and concerns about and fears of radiation have actually been more dangerous than the actual radiation exposure itself. My question is, in what sort of scenario or what kind of point where would you feel that from a nuclear accident that it would be quite legitimate, or you yourself would feel there would be a health danger to the public that would make you feel that people should get away? So, for example, can I go play in reactor 1 and be okay? Or at what level is there real legitimate concerns about a health danger from radiation in a nuclear accident in your assessment?
That's actually quite a difficult question, because it's actually, what do you feel comfortable with? Because that's really the issue. If you feel comfortable, then you should be able to do what you want to do. If you look at it from a statistical point of view, the evidence that we have where radiation starts, and only starts, is a very small start to show an increase in the cancer rate, is 100 millisieverts. Now, that's quite a high dose of radiation, and they reckon the lifetime dose to a Japanese who lived in the Fukushima area where there was no remediation, so they didn't skim the soil, is 10 millisieverts. So over a lifetime, tenfold that. And actually, we're not sure whether if you have it in smaller doses, you can tolerate an awful lot more, because we just can't do the experiment. So if you could say 100 millisieverts, but some people wouldn't feel comfortable at that. Personally, myself, I've had 3 CT scans in my life. That's 30 millisieverts. I fly regularly to Japan. That's 140 millisieverts each return trip. So I'm upping my dose all the time. Does that bother me? No, it doesn't bother me, because I know that I'm going to be exposed to about 140, 150 millisieverts over my lifetime, no matter what I do. I can't avoid that because it's around me. And I'm quite comfortable with the fact that we know a lot of radiation is very bad for you, But we have actually no idea, because we don't have enough points on the graph to be sure how to draw the curve at the lower levels. But when you see the data from the lifespan studies post the atomic bomb, you see that there is such a huge increase. So if you look at 100 millisieverts, it's a tiny blip, and you need a large population to see anything at all, which means the likelihood of me getting anything personally is very, very small. Well, once you get over 1 or 2 sieverts, not millisieverts, but sieverts, you then start to see quite a large increase. So it looks as if down this end, there's quite a lot of latitude. And it may be there are certain people who are more susceptible and certain people in society who are less susceptible. We just don't know who that is at the moment because, again, it's very difficult to do the study. So I would say it's a very personal thing, but what I would suggest is if you are worried about your radiation levels and you want to live in an area like Fukushima, why don't you have a personal dosimeter that you carry everywhere with you? Wander around and see how things vary, because radiation is, when you get in an accident like Fukushima, is not uniform. There are patches where there is more. And in fact, there's a lovely story about a lady who was worried about it, and a friend of mine gave her a dosimeter, and she stood over the drain where the water collects and goes down and all that comes off all the foliage. And it was for her, she felt that was too high. And she'd always been worried about, well, what is it in my house? She went into a house and she couldn't detect anything. And that gave her the confidence to say, well, OK, I won't stand over the drain for any length of time, but I can carry on my normal life. So I think it's what you feel most comfortable with. And with everything, everybody has their own limit. So I would not set a hard and fast rule, but I would say if you're happy to have a dosimeter and you're happy to live with that, then do that. If you don't want a dosimeter, then you want to carry on, that's fine too. So I don't think there's any one answer to your question, really.
But I did get a sense that around 1 sievert or so is when statistically...
100 millisieverts, so 0.1 sievert.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, we do have a very short amount of time left, so make it a short question, please.
My number one enemy is radiophobia. Mm-hmm. And I got the information from Kokuritsu Gan Center, National Cancer Center. Mm-hmm. According to that data, 1 millisievert radiation hazard to health is equivalent to not getting enough food, vegetable. 1,000 millisievert is equivalent to drinking too much.
This isn't sounding like a very short question.
2,000 millisievert is hazardous as smoking. Okay? That means before we start worrying about nuclear whatever, radiation health effect, we should stop smoking, drinking, or even driving.
Yes, driving's a lot more hazardous. I think it's a very good way of putting things into context, and there's a very good paper by somebody called Jim Smith, who works, I think it's in Portsmouth University, Plymouth University, one of the universities in the South Coast, and he tried to sort of put things into context. And to my huge surprise, if I live in London, which I do, and compare it with somewhere like Inverness, so it's a bit like living in Tokyo compared with living in the very far north of Japan, in rural North Japan, I actually suffer quite badly from the health consequences of breathing in particulate matter, in contamination from diesel engines and what have you. And I decreased my life expectancy by 2.8%. Okay, so an increased mortality of 2.8% if I live in London compared with Inverness, and that's just by choosing to live in a big city. If you compare that with even the liquidators post-Chernobyl, so the people involved in the cleanup operations who had 0.2 millisievert, so twice what the level that we would expect to see an increase in cancer, they have something like a 0.2, 0.5% detriment to them in mortality terms. So actually, it's more dangerous for me to live in London than it is for me to have been one of the people clearing up the mess post-Chernobyl. And certainly, you can tell by my body shape, I'm not very good at not eating. I do like my food, especially Japanese food. And actually, I decrease my lifetime expectancy by 10 years by virtue of the fact I'm fat. And that is much, much greater than even somebody who was very close to the atomic bomb when it was detonated within about a kilometre. So it shows you that we have this a little bit out of perspective. And really, radiation is not something that we should be worrying about quite as much as we are worrying about it. And there are much greater detriments to our health that we really could do something quite drastically about. And smoking is definitely one of them.
I just make one point. I think the way the discussion has gone today, I think you've picked up clearly our thoughts and views and from research and studies and so on of health effects on radiation and so on. What I wouldn't want anybody to go away from today feeling that we're in any way downplaying the seriousness of a nuclear accident. I know when we were in front of the cameras and we were trying to work out what was happening from a distance, there were people in those reactor buildings bringing things under control and doing what they could and trying to work out from inside what was happening. And so a nuclear accident is a serious thing. But the way we respond to that accident and the way we look after our people, there are lessons I think we can learn from each of these, Chernobyl and from Fukushima and so on, that maybe helps us to manage those situations better, to look after our public better, and part of that is how we communicate about these things. So there's always a balance in this, and I wouldn't want anybody to go away thinking that we're downplaying the seriousness of what is happening, and indeed the decommissioning challenges which will get resolved, but is a challenging situation.
Okay, well, please give a thank you for our guests for giving us a lot of new information today. And before we break up, I have 2 points to make about cards. First of all, cards. This man has brought us the University of Manchester energy cards, and if you want to score your pack, as I certainly am going to do right now, please come up and take them. And also, business cards, Meishi. If you want to exchange Meishi with our 2 guests, they will stay for a few minutes so that you may contact them later about your stories or other information. So thank you very much for coming today, and please come again soon.